Greetings. Thank you for tuning in to the cows. I hope the program will be constructive. We should have lots of helpful information about racism, what it is, and how it works. As I say consistently with the programs, excuse me, if you do not find the information helpful, please invest your time and energy in something else that you think would be helpful to replace racism with justice as soon as possible. Our guest for today's program, Facebook paying dividends, just having people on my Facebook group who consistently post constructive information, whether it's interesting books, constructive books, or just links to information that is helpful. Someone posted a link, brand new book coming out talking about the prison industrial complex and how that is inexorably linked to slavery and racism. And if my first response was, I think everybody, or at least a lot of the people that I know, are very well informed about the prison industrial complex and how much that relates to racism. Why do we need another book on prisons? But for some reason, I trusted Facebook. I checked the book out, and just chock full of excellent information, and really does a phenomenal job of tying the explosion in prison population across the country to slavery, racism, white supremacy. Our guest, he is a professor of American Studies at the University of Hawaii. His book, Texas Tough, The Rise of America's Prison Empire. Pleasure to have him on the program with us. You can also check out his website, texastough.com. It's linked in the description for this program. Just click his name and it'll take you right to the website. Our guest, Professor Robert Perkinson. Professor Perkinson, are you with us?
I'm with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. I appreciate it, sir. For folks, I guess, they have not read your book, they're not familiar with your work, could you give us just, a little background information on what it is you do and why you wrote this book?
Sure. It's a history of and imprisonment all the way from the first era of unfreedom in American history, slavery, to what sadly has become our own era of unfreedom in American history, mass imprisonment. And it focuses specifically on Texas, which is the most locked down state in the most incarcerated country in the world.
Wow. Okay. I want to hop right to it because there's so much material in your book. I'm going to try and share as much of that information with my audience as possible. You are a white man, is that correct?
That's right. From the South, actually. My family is all from the South. I mean, that's another way I kind of came into this project, because my dad's side of the family is from Virginia, and my mom's side is from Mississippi. And on my mom's side, there aren't too many white liberals in Mississippi. It's a sort of an endangered species, but they happen to be members of it. And so my grandfather and grandmother in the 50s were sort of speaking out in favor of integration when James Meredith was trying to integrate Ole Miss and during Freedom Summer and so on. And as a consequence, the Citizens Council kind of ran my grandfather out of Jackson, Mississippi, and they moved down to the coast. And so I grew up with this kind of notion that however much hatred and intolerance and ignorance might have infused Mississippi's history, because I came to believe as a young person that because people of conscience stood up for what was right and stood up for kind of righteousness and equality and justice, that the world was getting better. Racism would gradually be fading away. Mississippi would become more like the North, and the promises of the Declaration of Independence and the promises of emancipation would finally be fulfilled. But as I came of age as a college student and then in grad student at Yale, by some of the statistics, that wasn't the case. I mean, on the one hand, we've had tremendous progress in civil rights, obviously, culminating with the election of Barack Obama, no small matter, something that for most of my grandparents' lives would have been absolutely unfathomable. On the other hand, measures of racial inequality in criminal justice are worse now than they were at the height of Jim Crow segregation. African Americans were going to prison at about 4 times the rate of whites in 1950, before the March on Washington, before the War on Poverty, before the Civil Rights Act. Now they're going to prison at about 7 times the rate of whites, so twice. The prison population in the middle of the 20th century was 70% white. Now it's 70% non-white. So by some measures, America is dispensing more unequal justice now than it was before Jim Crow. And so I kind of really wanted to figure out why it was that the America my grandparents thought they were helping bring into being didn't come about. And that's why I ended up writing this book.
Wow. Okay. This program, the C.O.W.S context of white supremacy, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy. And when I use the term racism or white supremacy, I use those terms interchangeably. And the definition that I use for both racism and white supremacy is as follows. A global system of people classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you believe such a system exists, and do you think that definition is accurate?
I don't know if I would use exactly that same definition because it sounds like it sounds a little more kind of like unified than I think in some ways these political formations develop more kind of randomly and imperfectly, but the end result is the same. I mean, so I don't know, we could quibble about, and I'm a university professor, so in some ways my job is to quibble about definitions, but I think the results are the same, and I think we probably do have quite similar views about how this system came about. I mean, a real riddle for social scientists and political scientists in the last 20 years has been to figure out why is it that the United States has so radically departed from its own history and from all of the other countries that the United States economically and politically is similar to. Almost all industrial democracies, and the U.S. for most of its history, imprisoned about 0.1% of its population, so about 100 out of every 100,000. That rate is now almost 10 times higher in the United States. So we have a higher per capita imprisonment rate than authoritarian states like China or Iran by far. There's no other democracy that has ever incarcerated such a high portion of its citizens, and the rates among specifically black men, but to a lesser extent Latino men, are much, much higher than that. We're talking about a third of young African American men today, if present trends continue, can expect to spend time in prison. How is it that that system came about? There's all sorts of people who think it had to do with crime or with restructuring of the economy. What I really found in looking carefully at the research for writing my book, Texas Tough, over 200 years, is that really the only way you can explain that is by looking at the history of white supremacy and the history of race and politics in America. Now, it doesn't mean that people in 1960 sat down and said, oh my God, we have lost on integration and we must figure out how to re-imprison and re-enslave a significant portion of our population. I don't think anyone had that vision in 1960. But on the other hand, we have effectively done that. We have effectively, out of the ashes of segregation, built a new system of racial subordination and racial division through the prison system that very profoundly has undone some of the greatest triumphs of the civil rights movement. And so, in effect, we have created a system like the one that you describe, in which rights in our society are apportioned unequally, and the structures of law and order in the name of protecting equality and justice have actually furthered injustice. And sometimes that's the way that racism operates in our criminal justice system is rather overt, like racial profiling and the disparities between crack and powder cocaine. Other times it's much subtler. Like, for instance, one of the rules that I look to in kind of thinking about the ways that we've had white supremacist effects, not always with white supremacist intentions, is drug laws that were passed in the 80s and 90s in the name of protecting school children. And so all sorts of legislators, white and black, supported these sentencing enhancements for anyone who sold drugs within, say, a mile of a school, because it seems like a good idea, right? You don't want people selling crack or meth to your kid on the way to 5th grade. But what happens when you actually map that out geographically is that in the Bronx or South Central LA or South Chicago, or in the parts of Houston or New Orleans, there is no place on the map that is not within a mile of a school. And so every defendant charged with distributing drugs in what tend to be the most dense and predominantly non-white neighborhoods in America are getting sentencing enhancements, whereas if you're dealing meth in rural Nebraska, you get a comparatively lighter penalty. Now, it seems pretty clear if you look back at the congressional record that there wasn't intentional racism in the creating of that bill, but it's had profoundly racist effects. And the result from all of these laws is that African Americans are going to prison in huge numbers, and that 1.5 million African Americans have been disenfranchised, so excluded from the electoral system. So we do have a system in place which is similar to the one you describe. What's tricky about trying to figure out what I tried to figure out is how did we get there, and how do you reconcile the contradictions of our present moment, that we do have, we've got increasing rates of interracial marriage. We've seen legalized segregation for the most part fall apart. We've seen the gradual elevation of people of color to the highest levels of politics and culture, if not really business. And yet, in these other areas, we've got as extreme racism as we ever had. And that's a riddle that is not so easy to disentangle, and that's what I kind of try to do in the book. So I don't know. That's my sort of long-winded take on your definition. What's your thinking?
My thinking is that, in my view, the most important thing that you said that I agree with completely, whatever the intent was, the result is a system of white supremacy, regardless of whether folks sat down with the intention of doing all this. The end result is that we have it. And, moving forward.
And so how did we get there? I mean, I think we didn't get there because of a crime wave, although crime did go up in the 1960s as baby boomers came of age. I don't think we got there because of the kind of restructuring of the labor force, as some scholars have suggested, because globalization and deunionization happened in a lot of other societies as well. How we got out of here really comes out of civil rights, and and the backlash against civil rights. And I think, in a way, to my mind, the reason I wanted to write this book over a long period of history is that I found it's kind of difficult to, when you occupy your own moment in history, to have full clarity about the moment you're in. And so to me, it helped clarify our own moment if we went back and looked at this other vital period and turning point in American history after slavery, during Reconstruction. And to me, there are these kind of two pivotal moments that in the book Texas Tough I try to compare. One is, okay, the Civil War tears asunder the system of slavery upon which America was built, and especially in the South. And there was, for a moment, in the late 1860s and the early 1870s, a tremendous flourishing of freedom in American society. African Americans were being elected governor, senator, mayor. Public transportation trolley systems were being integrated. Black businesses were being set up. All sorts of black primary and secondary schools were being created with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau across the country. Colleges were being created. I mean, it really was a moment of great promise. And what happened out of that, as the federal government kind of pulled out its troops that were, and as former Confederate whites regained the right to vote, and most importantly, as whites reorganized and created the most effective and systematic terrorist campaign in American history, led by the KKK, African Americans were pushed back into second-class citizenship, and we got out of that lynching, Jim Crow segregation, and convict leasing that delayed the promises of emancipation for another century.
Professor Perkinson?
What I argue is the same thing has happened again. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. I wanted to, because I felt I really appreciated your thoroughness in this book, and especially you talk about the terrorism that recently freed slaves faced during or after Reconstruction. A key aspect of that, yes, the Ku Klux Klan, but I wanted you to share some of the information that you out in Texas Tough with regards to the Texas Rangers, because they are looked at as Americana and patriots and American heroes, and in your book you have historians referencing them as practitioners of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, so what I wanted to try to do in the book is, in order to understand how we got here, it helps to really trace the history back to the true roots of law enforcement and imprisonment. And typically the story of imprisonment has been a story of kind of well-meaning Christians in the early 19th century creating institutions that were supposed to make people better, and then they gradually kind of got better and better and created the correctional facilities that we have now. That's the kind of standard storyline. The standard storyline of law enforcement was that, as cities got bigger, the reformers got together and created these bodies to enforce the laws and bring public safety. And what I found as looking in the South is that really the origins of the disciplinary practices that come to dominate Southern prisons were forged not in these reformatory movements, but on Southern slave plantations. And law enforcement traces its roots back really to slave catchers. So the first kind of organized patrols and often uniformed patrols and kind of like official state or organizations that were set up to patrol law and order were really slave catching and slave disciplining organizations that all white men were supposed to participate in. And then in Texas, the most exalted law enforcement body in the state traces its roots really back to disciplining slaves on the one hand, but more importantly, clearing the land for white settlements and engaging in ethnic cleansing against Mexicans and Native Americans, especially Comanches. And if you look at the formation of the Texas Rangers, their first job was wiping out Native villages under the command of Stephen Austin himself, the founder of Texas, and really where they have distinguished themselves throughout the 19th and early 20th century is really primarily ethnic cleansing, not traditional law enforcement. And so the roots of these organizations are deeply embedded in our white supremacist past, and my contention is that they really have not broken from those roots. And you see it with the Texas Rangers that were involved in, union busting and anti-civil rights activities all the way up until the 1960s.
Again, thank you. Again, our guest, professor at the University of Hawaii, Professor Robert Perkinson. I felt that was very important. You're the second person to come on the program and talk about the white supremacist legacy of the Texas Rangers, and I hope people are listening closely, and you think about that the next time you go catch a baseball game down in Texas.
Right.
I want
of course, the Texas Rangers were implicated in all of these narcotics roundups in Texas in the 90s. You know, the Tulia debacle most successfully, in which, like a third of all black residents of this little tiny Texas town were rounded up and accused of being crack dealers, all based on the word of one corrupt, probably drug-addicted cop.
I believe Norm Stamper shared some information with us about that when he was on the program in November, but I appreciate that, the continuing legacy of racism, white supremacy. I want to ask you to share also, because an exception to the rule, Mr. George Washington Cable. I was ignorant about him until I read your book. I'd like you to share some of the information about him. But before I do, I want to, because you have so much incredible information in this book, I want to give just a little snippet of what's here. This is from page 20, where you said that you were talking about visiting some of the current inmates, and you said that there was one fellow, a self-described white country boy who used to work as a hospital clerk, reportedly gunned down his father, stepmother, and stepbrother, and then scattered hair and cigarette butts he had collected from black patients so as to pin the crime on, quote-unquote, drug-crazed niggers. This is from page 20, Texas Tough, The Rise of America's Prison Empire. But exception to the rule. Can you tell us a little bit about
Yeah, well, to be fair, he didn't get away with that.
Thank you.
He got caught and convicted and is on death row in Texas.
Right on.
But he did, it's kind of illustrative that he would think of, that even whites recognized the discrimination of law enforcement so much that he thought this would be an effective way for him to get away with a crime, and no doubt others have done the same and gotten away with it. He didn't. Wow.
Yeah, I know there are other examples of folks who have attempted similar crime, active racism. But again, an exception to the rule. Mr. George Washington Cable, could you tell our listeners a little bit about him?
Sure. Well, the first thing you have to kind of understand in order to understand his importance is that all of the southern prison systems faced a kind of crisis in their criminal justice systems after emancipation. Before emancipation, the formal criminal justice apparatus was really set up just for whites who broke the law, because almost always African Americans, and almost all of them were slaves, were disciplined by their owners. So the state had very little involvement. But all of a sudden, with emancipation and the end of the Civil War, all of a sudden all these people who were property suddenly become citizens, and they are subject to the regulation of the law rather than the whims of their masters. Now, and because in the early part of Reconstruction, a lot of the same people who had led their states into the Civil War were still in charge, they set up all of these laws to try and keep former slaves working in a subordinate status for their former masters. So they created, what all your listeners will know, all the kind of vagrancy statutes, black codes, bonded labor contracts. And so huge numbers of former slaves suddenly were getting arrested, getting criminal convictions. And I went through just like page after page after page of records of people getting long sentences for petty crimes, stealing a pair of shoes, stealing a shirt, a pair of pants, and getting 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. Whereas whites at this time were committing murders at a very high rate, the highest rate of homicide in American history after the Civil War, and almost all of them were going free. So this bumper crop of black felons was being created. Not quite as many, it should be said, as the bumper crops of black felons being created by our current regime. And there wasn't enough space in the penitentiary for all these people. And so Southern power brokers turned to a loophole in the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits slavery, of course, but if you look, there's an exception clause. It says except as punishment for a crime. And so they started re-enslaving these people with felony convictions, many of them former slaves, and selling them, essentially, or leasing them, as the terminology was at the time, to the highest bidder, railroads, coal mining companies, and mostly in Texas, sugar and cotton planters. And so a lot of the kind of robber barons of the New South, the captains of industry and commerce, made their fortunes in the post-Civil War era, continuing to use unfree labor, prisoners by the thousands, tens of thousands. The biggest mining companies in the South, the biggest sugar planters in the South, all of them kind of recreated their wealth through convict labor, but it was a horrendous system, and it was not nearly as systematic or as large of a system as slavery, but in some narrow ways it was worse because the economics of slavery were such that there was a strong interest in the master at least keeping their slave well enough fed and cared for to live a long life, because that person represented a significant capital investment, whereas the contracts for criminals were such that you could just work the person until they dropped dead, and then the state would send you a new young felon from the court. So there was very little incentive for you to provide any medical care or even sufficient rations, and I estimate that something like 30,000 people perished in this system, and that's probably a pretty dramatic undercount, because I wasn't looking at all of the cozy relationships with for low-level misdemeanors that sheriffs had going on with planters and so on. So it was a system, it was kind of a new system of slavery in which people were worked from dawn to dusk in horrid conditions and dying in droves. One railroad camp I looked at in Texas, 18 out of 40 people died within about a month from malaria and being beaten or shot, trying to escape, and so on. It was at 4 months, actually, but now that I look back at my notes. And George Washington Cable was one of the first people who really started speaking out against this. He was a very famous novelist in the South, kind of not quite as famous as Mark Twain, but ended up becoming friends with Mark Twain. He came from New Orleans. He wrote all these kind of picturesque novels about life in New Orleans. He had fought for the Confederacy, but started to have his doubts about how the South was leading itself into ruin, and he did an investigation of the Orleans Parish Prison, which is still a nightmare, and a century and a half later, and became a vociferous critic of convict leasing, and then quite an aggressive critic against white supremacy generally, and for which he was kind of banished from the South, and finally had to kind of move to Massachusetts, where he passed away the rest of his days.
Wow. An exception to the rule. And he was banished for not supporting racism, white supremacy, having the audacity.
Not officially, but he felt there were enough threats, and it was uncomfortable enough for his family. And that same thing happened to my grandparents. There was a very small minority of white liberals in the South, and they were made to feel like traitors, and so a lot of them left.
Wow. Again, our guest, author of Texas Tough, The Rise of America's Prison Empire, Dr. Robert Perkinson, University of Hawaii. I want to read another passage, incredible read. But next up, I want you to, this convict leasing system, so people really get an idea of how gruesome this was. But this is from page 207, talking about the prison rodeos. This has come up before on the program. I believe we spoke about this when Mr. Anthony Pryor was on the program. But on 207, you write that even in the rodeos, a racial hierarchy took center stage. In the early years, only white men competed as cowboys, with African Americans and Mexicans relegated to a farcical free-for-all like convict poker, in which prisoners sat gambling around a table with an angry bull loose in the arena, the last man seated won a prize. White women only occasionally appeared, usually to sing patriotic carols. Black women, by contrast, could sign up for the sexualizing greased pig sacking contest, in which participants hitched up their skirts and rolled around in the mud in pursuit of ornery swine, all to the hooting delight of spectators, free and convict alike. In this way, the Texas prison rodeo exhibited nostalgia for not just the frontier, but the Old South. It brought the minstrel show to the cattle drive. Page 207, Texas Tough. You have any thoughts on that passage?
Yeah, no, I mean, the rodeo is remembered quite fondly by most Texans because it became, one of the biggest tourist attractions in the state until it was finally, mainly for legal liability concerns, shut down in the 80s. Although I think there's still an active rodeo that's quite similar in Louisiana at Angola and I believe in Oklahoma too. But yeah, it's kind of remembered fondly, and people kind of erase this racial history of it. But it really is was a spectacle of a gladiatorial spectacle of racial degradation, as well as a forum for prisoners to compete and have a chance to earn a little bit of money. So they had willing participants because the daily life was so bleak for a prisoner that almost any diversion they would accept. But they really were these kind of spectacles of humiliation for the people who were there. The mastermind of the creation of the rodeo was this director of the prison system named Lee Simmons in the 1930s, and he took over after this remarkable period of reform in Texas prisons in which mostly white women liberals, former suffragists who won the right to vote in Texas, kind of took over the Texas prison system in the 20s, and they tried to break from those slaving roots. They tried to sell off the plantations that formed the basic infrastructure of the Texas penal system and create a kind of hospital, college-type therapeutic set of institutions in their place, but they were sabotaged by the guards and by the legislators who cut their budget when they did take over and their system didn't work. And the hardliner who came in their wake was Lee Simmons, and he was a hard-driving guy who believed in restoring the whip and making prisoners work without pay, primarily by threats of violence. He expanded the system of convict guards, which had always been present in the southern prison systems and persisted all the way into the 1980s, in which some prisoners, mostly whites, though not exclusively, were kind of given better cells or given punks or better meals or privileges in exchange for being enforcers and snitches and really full-fledged guards.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
Did you say punk? Okay, and can you explain what that is for our listeners, please?
Well, there's this kind of sexual economy in prison still, but now it's kind of has come to more public attention, and so officers have in recent years have been trying to kind of stomp some of this out. But rape and sex was really used as a system of control and management for most of Texas prison history, and favored convicts, those who would work as enforcers. So if there was a labor strike, they would be the ones who would pass out clubs to these guys, and they would go beat the prisoners back to work. Or if somebody mouthed off to an officer or just got out of line in any way, it was these convict building tenders, as they were called in Texas, who would do the dirty work for the guards, because the southern states never wanted to pay enough money to actually run a prison system professionally with paid staff. Texas still doesn't pay its staff enough to really run a professional prison system. The people who run the system make Walmart wages in Texas. But one of the ways they compensated these prisoner enforcers, they usually gave them, better cells. They gave them better meals. They had kind of privileges to move about when and where they wanted. But they also had kind of first dibs on when new weak weak-seeming or sometimes gay or sometimes effeminate or just young prisoners would come in, they would have first dibs of getting them as a cellmate, and then they often would kind of like rape and degrade them until they became a kind of sex slave and housekeeper, where they would make the prisoner's bed and iron their uniforms and polish their shoes, and so that was sadly a fairly well-established practice.
Wow. I want you to kind of share how this, I would even say that there's evidence in your book that white people did sit down and establish a system of white supremacy, and I'll say Exhibit A, the Redeemer Constitution of 1876. You and your book.
There you have it, for sure.
Okay, can you explain how we have it there, please?
Well, I mean, after Reconstruction began to fall apart, there was this moment in Texas history, a pretty unique and mostly forgotten moment, when under the leadership of this governor, Edmund Davis, when really a lot of stuff started to change in Texas in the early 1870s. African Americans started voting in great numbers. They started winning elections. A new police force was created instead to kind of compete with the Texas Rangers, and it was racially integrated, and it was arresting whites at equal rates to blacks. And whites, conservatives, were howling about discrimination and police brutality for the first and only time in Texas history, when their crimes were for the first time being targeted by law enforcement instead of just petty property crimes. And that regime was finally driven out of power under force of arms and electorally as whites regained the right to vote. They had been disenfranchised for treason, but under the kind of quite lenient terms of Reconstruction were re-granted the right to vote by the early 1870s and reestablished power with the help of the first KKK, black judges and black community organizers were all driven out and often massacred all over the state and all over the South, and white supremacy was restored in this moment that the white Democrats called, because the Democratic Party was the white man's party then, and that kind of switched in the 1960s, as we'll talk about later. And they did set up kind of political structures to make sure that, or what they hoped would make sure that white supremacy and local rule would continue forever. So that's why we have elected judges in Texas. There were all of these efforts to kind of decentralize the state because whites had the numerical majority in most Texas counties. Since the Democratic Party, they set up these white-only primaries because you weren't allowed to bar blacks explicitly from voting in general elections as a way to restore white electoral power. And yeah, we got a regime of white supremacy and that was quite intentional, although they always claimed that it wasn't. Interestingly, if you go back and look at what now are quite transparently overt acts of political racism, all of the perpetrators of them were claiming that they had no racist intent at the time, just as much as people claim now that greater penalties for crack cocaine has nothing to do with race, or that the Tea Party movement has nothing to do with race. So by looking at the words and the actions of those people 100 years ago, I think you really get some clarity about the way that race continues to infuse our politics.
Again, our guest, Dr. Robert Perkinson's Context of White Supremacy. I must say it is incredibly refreshing to speak with any guest, white or non-white, who is comfortable using the term white supremacy, because the evidence just clearly shows it would be the most accurate term to use. Wow. Okay, the convict leasing system. I was kind of ignorant about how all of that worked, and particularly how gruesome the system was. Like in your book, you have statistics from the Tuskegee Institute where between 1880 and 1930, you had 3,220 reported victims of lynching. Over the same time period, you probably had more than 30,000 deaths of black inmates during the convict leasing period of Texas. Can you kind of tell us, about this gruesome system?
Yeah, well, and that was 30,000 deaths of all prisoners of all types, because Mexican and white prisoners were also being leased. So the prison system then and now was quite brutal for whites and Mexicans too, but it was always more brutal for African Americans. And it was interesting if you go back and look at the records, the way they made that so. You would often find in the records, like if they acquired a new prison property, a new plantation, the prison officials would go down and visit, and they would say, they would go back down and say, this sugar plantation is really muggy, the malaria is really bad here, there's a lot of kind of illness, and it's really a brutal place it's really a lot more brutal than a prison that we've just acquired in northern or central Texas, where it's a little drier, there's a little more wind. So we'll make that nicer one the white leased plantation, and we'll make the harshest one the black plantation. So they were always quite explicit about that. Or if you go and look at they'll also would say things in convict leasing like at a wood chopping camp, because all the transcontinental railroads contracted with these prisoners to cut wood to make their railroad ties, as they were building the roads of commerce that helped build the country. In that sense, the country in some ways was built by prison labor in the same way that the antebellum America was built by slaves. But the requirement usually was that African Americans would have to produce, say, a cord of wood or a cord and a half of wood a day, whereas whites might be required to produce half a cord or 3/4 of a cord. So there were usually racially differentiated quotas. And African Americans suffered much higher fatality rates under convict leasing. That's not to say it wasn't bad for whites. It was for poor whites too. And Texas and Southern systems have always been pretty brutal social systems for anyone at the bottom or toward the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, whether you're white or black. It just so happens that the vast majority of people clustered at the bottom are people of color. So in that sense, it's a kind of system of economic subordination and a system of entwined with a system of racial subordination, and remains so today. But convict leasing did have tremendous fatality rates, and that 30,000 estimate that I have in the book Texas Stuff is probably an underestimate, because I wasn't really dealing with all of the local peonage arrangements that local sheriffs set up. And Douglas Blackman's book, he has a new book out that won the Pulitzer Prize last year.
Slavery by Another Name.
Right, and he deals with that peonage side, and I deal with the more kind of state felony side, and so the fatality rate might double or even triple if you count that other system. But people were worked in the summer to the point of heat stroke and exhaustion. And really strong people who had a lot of experience working in agriculture might be able to do fine, but city kids who got sent to the prison system, they might not last a week. The worst were, so they were dying of malaria. If they tried to escape, they were shot down. They died of all sorts of infectious diseases because there was very little hygiene in these communal wooden barracks. Sometimes the prisoners were loaded into boxcars that looked like something almost out of the Holocaust, as people are, 30 prisoners are loaded into a boxcar with barred windows and rolled out to turpentine camps or wood chopping camps far out from civilization. And some of the worst were in coal mines, where you had, huge accidents, sometimes 100 or more miners killed in single accidents in Alabama and Tennessee. So it's a mostly forgotten history of unfree labor and really unspeakable brutality. And some people at the time really did call it worse than slavery, because there was just such kind of callous and systemic disregard for human life. And it should be noted.
Go ahead.
It should be noted that a lot of women were sucked into the system too, in very small numbers compared to men. But you even see the racial divisions even starker in the records of female imprisonment, because it's a tiny handful of white women who end up in prison in the South, And when they did end up in Texas, they were usually not required to work, or they did maybe a little sewing, but they were mostly just kind of locked up or and kind of neglected, whereas black women were put on to work gangs and sent out to the fields to pick cotton or hoe or dig ditches or build roads with less intense quotas than men, but still work very much like black women would have performed under slavery.
Double whammy.
Wow, that was what I was going to say, that the debasement was especially intense for black inmates. You have just I'm speechless, the photographs that you have in the book. Can you kind of talk about one in particular? It's a photograph showing some of these inhumane methods of punishment that white officers, white wardens used against black inmates. It looks like there's a black male. He's in a fetal position and he's bound. Can you talk about this image?
I mean, there is a surprisingly rich set of technologies of punishment and torture that were devised. Interestingly, many of them surfaced again in the War on Terror. Waterboarding was a punishment that northern prisons devised in the 19th century when whipping became controversial. They didn't use that in the South because whipping persisted much longer in Texas all the way into the 1940s. Whipping was always the predominant form of discipline in the Southern prison system, but as that became somewhat more controversial in the populist era and the progressive era, and humanitarians were, because whites were also being whipped, and sometimes whipped to death, that was often quite controversial. And so they increasingly turned to different types of solitary confinement. They were kind of hitching posts where people were hobbled and just tied to a log or to a stump, as that picture describes. There were dark houses or sweat boxes, which were basically like kind of outhouses that you would build, and you would kind of lock someone in for 12 hours or 24 hours, but sometimes people were put in there for longer. In fact, one of the incidents that I describe in the book from 1913 was a bunch of white officers got especially mad at one group of black inmates for doing some sort of a work strike because they were saying they were being overworked. And so they piled, I think, 12 of them into one of these sweat boxes that was made for two people, very small space, about the size of a small apartment bathroom. And they left them in there for 48 hours, and there wasn't enough oxygen, and so there were 4 air holes, and the only 4 people who survived were those who happened to be located right where the air holes were, and all of the others were killed. Later in the 20th century, a whole other series of there are plenty of other stocks and hobbling and tying. They would shackle these big spears to people's legs so they couldn't run when they were working far away from somewhere. They would either shackle their feet together, or they would put a shackle like an ankle bracelet, and then there would be long rods extending from the end of it, which would trip you if you tried to run, so you couldn't escape. Later in the 20th century, the punishments got a little bit more creative once whipping was abolished in the 40s. And then officers seemed to almost delight in the 50s and 60s with coming up with all sorts of peculiar punishments. Like, for instance, if you were caught, one guy I interviewed was caught with a watermelon in his cell because he had, wanted a little bit of extra food, and so he had smuggled one back to his cell to eat with his cellie. And the officers forced him to carry a watermelon around for a month, everywhere he went, just as it kind of like rotted and drizzled grime all over his clothes. Another guy got caught stealing a steak, and he was forced to eat a whole tray of steaks and continue vomiting it up, so he would eat more and more and more. So there were these kind of, and then people were also just like beaten, sometimes beaten to death. So there were a real panoply of punishments, and very little accountability or oversight until the 1960s, when, for the first and only time in American history, the courts started paying attention to the little people in American society under the Warren Court, and that's where we got the civil rights rulings, we got all of the civil liberties rulings, we got pro-labor rulings, and we got rulings that allowed prisoners to kind of bring their grievances to the federal court, and all of that now under the Rehnquist-Roberts courts, all of that is now gone, and the courts are again in the courts of the big people in American society.
Double whammy.
Wow. One of the things that really stood out, again, this book, so thorough, so detailed. You dug through and got archives of prisoners and their own writings, whether they got it published or not. And one of the things that really stood out, the white inmates and them talking about their loss of whiteness and manhood.
Yeah.
You've already talked a lot about how black people had an especially tough time, but for white people, this environment was like a descent into hell, losing their whiteness.
Right, and that was really interesting to me, that it seemed, we don't have, until the 1960s, we don't have as rich of an archive. There aren't as many black voices preserved, partially because the conditions were so much more brutal, and because the education system under segregation was so inequitable that there aren't as many African Americans who were going to prison in these early periods who were kind of literate and inclined to kind of write their memoirs, and not as many people inclined to listen to them. Although you can find all sorts of black writing in clemency records, letters to the governor. But yeah, whites wrote this whole series of memoirs under convict leasing. And yeah, a lot of times what they, to them in some ways, imprisonment, even though it wasn't as brutal, not nearly as brutal as it was for African Americans, it was somehow to them even more shocking, because even if they were lower class, as most of them were, casual laborers, in the system of Jim Crow white supremacy in the South, they had been accustomed to being treated with a kind of minimal level of respect. That was part of the privilege of whiteness. That might be all you had as a poor tenant farmer in the 1920s. That might be your only mark of respect and distinction, is that you were white. And then all of a sudden you came into the prison system, and while you still had white privileges, you were treated in a pretty degrading way too, and subjected to stoop labor. You were out working on work gangs, maybe with lower quotas, but still exhausting quotas. You still got whipped if you didn't meet the quota. You still had to kind of follow all of these humiliating and depersonalizing rules, like for many years you weren't allowed to speak in the dining room. You had to you were given these demeaning nicknames by your officers. You had to tip your hat whenever you came into the presence of an officer, and so on. So they really did, for the first time, experience, what I came to think of as almost a sort of racial passing. They came to experience what it was like to be systematically kind of debased by a higher authority, and they talked about it, in terms of their manhood being stripped away, and as a totally humiliating experience of slavery. And to imagine that, as bad as all of what they described was, to imagine that what blacks were experiencing was even worse, was pretty shocking. And reading those archives was, you sit for hours and hours and hours, and you go through these sheafs of pleas by prisoners, and it really is, after a while, kind of heartbreaking. I remember coming across letters where people were pleading for mercy, and I could tell by the way that the letter had been routed that really nobody had ever read it, but they were just pouring out their heart, talking about the economic circumstances that led them to get convicted, the unfairness of their conviction, the horrendous way they were being treated, the way their infection on their foot had abscessed, and if they didn't get mercy, they were going to have their foot amputated. And only 100 years later was someone actually reading this letter for the first time with any care.
Professor Robert Perkinson, author, Texas Tough, The Rise of America's Prison Empire. Exhibit B is coming for evidence that white people from time to time do sit down and explicitly map out how they're going to expand, maintain white supremacy. I would use your book to say that there have been specific times where white people have not only said we're going to use white supremacy to build more prisons, we're going to use white supremacy to win the governor's seat. Sometimes we're going to use white supremacy to even win the presidency of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, Texas examples, George Bush 1 and George Bush 2. But before I get to them, this is page 306. This would be another example. During his 3 campaigns for governor, 2 of them successful, Bill Clements, oil driller extraordinaire, and Nixon's former Deputy Secretary of Defense, played the game both to suppress votes and to attract them. In one contest, his Secretary of State tried to purge thousands of felons from the voter rolls. On Election Day, Clements' campaign reportedly posted menacing signs in Dallas's black precincts, warning potential voters they could be imprisoned for various types of voter fraud. That should sound familiar.
Right, a lot.
To bolster his support among crime-fearing whites, Clements lambasted the Democratic incumbent, Mark White, for releasing hundreds of prisoners and ran a TV ad accusing him of paroling predatory rapists. Another example, I would say. But yeah, if you want to share info on that, that would be
sure.
Great too.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think this is actually a good place to kind of lay out what ultimately is the kind of central argument of the book, in that mass imprisonment in the United States really has grown out of the poisonous politics of race in American society, in the same way I argued that Jim Crow grew out of a reaction against emancipation and Reconstruction. It's a kind of 2 steps forward for freedom and 1 step back that has happened at other times in American history. But basically what I think happened is that the Democratic Party white supremacist system of control in the South, by the 1950s, it is teetering toward collapse because of the freedom movement that arose under the leadership of Dr. King and others, and because the kind of northern states and politicians no longer had so much tolerance for Southern Jim Crow because it was embarrassing on the international stage, and because the courts, for the first time, were giving the subjugated in American society a hearing. And so by the mid-1960s, Jim Crow segregation collapses. Now, the leaders of the segregationist establishment, people like Strom Thurmond, warned in the 1950s. You can go back and look at their speeches in the congressional record. They warned that if we get integration of the races, we're going to have a terrifying wave of crime and juvenile delinquency, and therefore we need to. Well, that's what they warned. And when they were defeated on, what I argue is that when they were defeated on civil rights, they turned to law enforcement to discipline and control this incipient social order that they had feared and fought against. And instead of talking about white man's government, they started talking about law and order. And they continued sometimes talking about states' rights. States' rights rhetoric has really made a comeback. So that happens in the Democratic Party. The white supremacist conservative wing of the Democratic Party starts talking about law and order. And if you look back at the statute book and congressional, legislative assembly session records, you'll see in Texas, for instance, in 1969, the same year that all of the segregationist statutes were swept from the books in the 1969 legislative session, is the same year that they're authorizing adult prosecution for juveniles, funding the construction of the largest prison in state history, and they begin ramping up penalties for all sorts of drug crimes. So now so one hand we see a retreat from defending segregation to enforcing law and order. In some ways, in a simplistic way of saying it, white conservatives said, okay, look, if the government is going to force me to allow blacks to move into my neighborhood, it better be the Cosby family. And if it's not the Cosby family, if, like, the young people in that family start wearing baggy clothes or whatever, or much less dealing drugs or causing any sort of trouble, then I want to have a lot of police on hand, and I want to send those people to prison. And that's essentially what we have done. I mean, there's a quote that I found resonant with Texas's arch segregationist Senator Joseph Bailey in the early 20th century. He said, "Hey, I want to treat the Negro fairly," he said, as so long as he behaves himself. And if he doesn't, I want to drive him from this country. And that essentially is what America has done. We have banished a generation of African American youth into a kind of gulag of subjugation and a lifetime of second-class citizenship. Now, what you were talking about was another piece, is that as the Democratic Party was starting to fracture and reposition, the Republican Party all of a sudden got a bright idea that they got really from George Wallace. And they figured out, hey, this New Deal coalition that FDR put together and LBJ, Road to Victory in 1964, that was holding together all these disparate elements in the South, if we start going after the white voters who are angry about civil rights and afraid of crime and urban disorder, we could build a new white coalition for our party. And Barry Goldwater was the first Republican who really figured that out, and Richard Nixon is the one who rode that Southern strategy, as it's called, to victory. And ever since, the Republican Party from 1964 forward has been the white man's party in America. It's been the party of angry white men who are either it's been the party of explicit racism, but it's also been the party of just kind of white anxiety and disaffection, and of course also the party of wealth. And they have used the rhetoric of law and order to build a pretty formidable electoral coalition. The reason I said it doesn't mean not everybody who votes for Richard Nixon, not everyone who hears Richard Nixon give a speech on law and order realizes that he is intentionally kind of creating a racially divisive issue that will help him win votes. Some of those people really are genuinely concerned about crime, but they have successfully put together a kind of racialized strategy of electoral mobilization, and we see echoes of that in the way the Tea Party is reacting to Obama's healthcare initiative. I mean, we have, quite remarkably, an extremely moderate president on all of the issues who has pursued a centrist, moderate, often pro-corporate course on everything from banking regulation to healthcare. And yet, whites are able to actually believe that he is kind of involved in some sort of Mau communist takeover of America. And that kind of self-delusion that we see in the Tea Party really has its roots in the same way that America dealt with law and order, and it's the same way that Arizona is dealing with immigration. That you have racial anxieties and anger that gets entwined and mixed up in all sorts of complicated ways with all sorts of other anxieties about unemployment and globalization and immigration and crime. And out of it comes a kind of toxic brew that has poisoned American politics and led to the resurgence of conservatism that has dominated and changed our country over the last 40 years. And that built a prison nation.
Again, our guest, Professor Robert Perkinson, author of Texas Tough. Specifically to show, because a big part of you can see, you can learn a lot about the so-called prison industrial complex by studying the history of prisons in Texas. And you show how this ends up having national, even global implications. I guess if we could tie it up in one person, George W. Bush. Can you talk about how you see a lot of this same racism, white supremacy, and a lot of the vestiges of what took place, the conflict leasing system and all that, with the way that we have responded post-event, Abu Ghraib? Can you kind of make a connection between those incidents?
Well, you know, it was funny for me as a teacher. I had always been teaching kind of in two areas. I taught in criminal justice and then I taught U.S. foreign policy classes, and I always kind of thought of them as different until after 9/11, after the Abu Ghraib scandal, I started finding all of these, every aspect of these punishments that were being dished out to supposed terrorists at Guantanamo and Bagram and in Abu Ghraib. I had read those same stories in the archives of Texas imprisonment. The kind of sexual humiliation, the beatings, the sleep deprivation, even the waterboarding in other states, that kind of systematic debasement and brutal interrogation. And it seemed to me what had happened is a lot of the law enforcement ethos that Bush and his aides had cultivated on the ground in Texas, the ways they imagined criminal justice, which really was through a presumption of guilt rather than a presumption of innocence, a view of unfettered executive authority, so interference by the legislature or the courts, much less human rights organizations, they regarded as a kind of nuisance in Texas prisons to be fought against, as they fought successfully against federal court oversight. And they in a way exported Southern or Texas justice abroad, and with pretty horrendous results. You know, they were, and let me just give you some, I mean, we all know, I think, the system of justice that the Bush administration set up abroad, in which anyone who was labeled a terrorist would have, under the first iteration of this system proposed by the Bush administration, they would have no right to counsel. They would have no right to a jury trial. They could be imprisoned for life, sometimes without even knowing the charges against them. They could be convicted based on secret evidence. There would be no involvement of the judiciary or the executive branch or international law. It would be entirely controlled by the U.S. military. People could even be executed without even unanimous jury. They could be executed with unanimous jury verdicts, but they could be imprisoned for life with non-unanimous jury verdicts. I mean, really kangaroo courts that were set up. But what struck me is that in many ways Texas's courts are kangaroo courts. Texas has, we all know, the highest rate of execution in the United States, not the biggest death row, so not the harshest juries, really, but they do have the highest rate of carrying death penalty cases all the way to fatal conclusion. And that has to do with a couple of things. One, that the system of indigent defense is so incredibly anemic in the state. In Texas, there's no public defender system. It's kind of starting to get set up now, but until just the last few years, there was absolutely no public defender system. Instead, judges appointed attorneys for indigent defendants, which is most defendants, and they paid them a set amount of money to defend each person, which meant that the economics incentive structure was such that the less you did for your client, the more money you made per hour. So every extra mile you went for your client was money out of your pocket, and that was true for death penalty cases as well. And that's why we got, drunk attorneys who were falling asleep during their clients' trials, and attorneys unwilling to challenge judges because then they were worried they wouldn't get appointed anymore. And it kind of started to attract the dredges of the legal profession. Of course, there were some people in that system who were heroically, for humanitarian and altruistic reasons, trying their damnedest and working very hard, but others who weren't. So on the one hand, you have an incredibly inequitable public defense system for indigent defendants. You also have elected judges, which is a relic of hostility to the judiciary and the federal government, and do-gooding judges that dates all the way back to the slavery period, when masters didn't want anybody interfering with what they did within their demarcated land line. And then the other piece of it is that you have incredibly prosecutorial appellate courts in Texas. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has become, in some ways, a kind of laughingstock. It's been rebuked regularly by the U.S. Supreme Court, which we all know is no bastion of liberalism these days. There's a strong, hard right majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, but the decisions of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals are so outlandish that they have provoked really indignation on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court. Let me just give you some examples. They have, when it was discovered that a prosecutor and the judge were sleeping together during a trial, they refused to order a new trial. They twice refused to release a defendant who was proved innocent twice by DNA evidence. They are pursuing the execution of a defendant now who has never had the physical evidence from his crime scene subjected to DNA testing, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. And so there is, and it took the U.S. Supreme Court to step in and stop Texas from executing people who were juveniles or mentally retarded or insane as well. And so in Texas, there really was this system in place where there was very little judicial accountability, very few kind of checks and balances on prosecutors. And it was that kind of ethos of law enforcement first, civil liberty second or last, that the Bush administration took with them. And it was many of the same people. Alberto Gonzalez, for example, who was in charge of helping lead the clique of White House and Pentagon officials who set up these kangaroo courts in Guantanamo, is the same person who used to sign off on George W. Bush's execution dossiers when he was governor of Texas. And a long piece in The Atlantic a few years ago revealed that he was doing that very unfairly. The Attorney General is supposed to give the governor, at that last moment of possible clemency, all of the best arguments for the defense and all of the best arguments for the prosecution. But Gonzalez was just leaving out the best arguments for the defense and writing memos that encouraged Bush to execute in all cases, as he almost always did, and Bush often just glanced at them during his workouts and approved executions. And that's why executions under Bush's watch became a kind of assembly line affairs, unlike in other states, where there really was very little judicial or executive review. And that's why Texas executes a fair number, we're quite sure, has executed some innocent people, including, the person who was profiled famously in the New Yorker recently, Cameron Todd Willingham, who was one of my research subjects.
Wow. Professor Perkinson, we had a lot of folks that called in, so I want to give them an opportunity to ask questions. Before I hit the phone lines, I guess these would be two more exhibits of incidents when I think white people sometimes blatantly, sometimes indirectly, appeal to white supremacy to motivate white people to action and to their own personal benefit. The first, this is not in your book, but it is related. Ronald Reagan, when he pitched his bid for his first White House run, he goes to Neshoba County and says, "I'm states' rights," Neshoba County, where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were executed by racist white supremacists who also said we're states' rights. That would be one. And number two would be George Bush the First and his run for the White House against Michael Dukakis, Willie Horton. Can you explain Willie Horton and his significance to our listeners?
Well, it's this. The Republicans figured out from Barry Goldwater forward, following the lead of George Wallace, that a good way for them to... It was no longer acceptable in post-civil rights America to overtly make appeals to white supremacy. In fact, many whites, opinion polls suggest, would not even those who did have all sorts of subterranean biases in their own minds, would no longer even respond to old-fashioned appeals to white supremacy, because they no longer thought of themselves as racist. But the Republicans figured out that you could tap in to even with people who didn't think of themselves as white supremacists, you could tap into their racial bias and you could tap into their racial fears and anxieties by talking about law and order and talking about women not being safe on the streets, talking about young people today in inner cities, talking about welfare queens, driving Cadillacs, as Reagan kind of famously did. And there were all sorts of ways that they could talk about race without seeming to talk about race, and that they could mobilize conservative, angry white voters by talking about affirmative action or now immigration or crime in ways that seemed race neutral but really weren't. And in their often in their secret correspondence, you can see that the politicians leading this effort actually often were quite explicit about it, but that the voters who might have voted for them may or may not have been, depended upon the person. And one of the most famous examples, as you point out, one of the most successful, was George Bush I's campaign against Michael Dukakis, in which they kind of sorted through all of the records of people being let out of prison in Massachusetts, and they found one sensational case that perfectly fit the kind of demographic they were going for, a black man who was let out on a furlough, which was a long-standing policy in Massachusetts across the United States during this period under Republican as well as Democratic governors, but the truth was not what mattered so much as the campaign ad. And they put together, which you can watch these online or read more about in the book. They put on these ads highlighting Willie Horton and saying that, here's what Michael Dukakis does. He lets out black rapists of white women, lets them out of prison, and the kind of subtext there is that, well, there's no subtext. The text there is that, if you want to protect your family from menacing urban criminals, then you better vote for a tough, reliable law enforcement candidate, Bush. And lots of people responded, lots of white voters responded to that ad. Polls suggest quite favorably, and people think that it played a pretty important role in his victory.
Unless I'm mistaken, reports that I've seen, he was trailing Mr. Dukakis, and Willie Horton changed things dramatically in that campaign. I could be incorrect, but
I think it's regarded as a kind of turning point. And there are a lot of things in that election, but it's regarded as an important tactical move for him, and Republican candidates across the country in this period realized that, a critical way to solidify their white base of support. And the Republican Party is now overwhelmingly a white party in the United States. It's something that really is not discussed in the mainstream media, that it really has become as white of an organization as the NAACP is, or MECHA are Mexican-American or black organizations. I mean, it has at the moment a titular head of an African-American guy, and they right now are running a fair number of African-American candidates. But if you look at the complexion of their conventions and the Tea Party, this newest kind of formation of the Republican Party, it's an incredibly white organization, and overwhelmingly an upper income and a southern white organization. Now, over the long term, that's a dying demographic in American history, according to the census, because of immigration, because of migration within the United States, and the United States is not going to be a majority white country forever. But for this interval, the Republican Party has found that's a good way for them to win elections, and they may do very well following that same template in the midterm elections coming up. Now they're tending to talk about immigration, and they're not tending to talk about crime so much. And the reason for that is that the way the Democrats neutralized this attack on civil rights and this attempt by the Republicans to build their white voter base talking about crime, the way Democrats responded to that attack was not by counterattacking, but by surrendering and adopting those same policies. And that's what Clinton did kind of most successfully, that he became, after he lost the 1992 midterm elections, or the 1994 midterm elections, he became a law and order president and presided over signed the most severe federal crime bills in American history, and is responsible for locking up actually more people than any president before or since, in a certain way. Now, the Obama administration thus far has not kind of played the politics of crime in the same mercenary way that the Clinton administration has. On the other hand, they haven't really made criminal justice reform a priority. My hope and the hope of some people is that they will do so, because we do have kind of we could conceivably have an opportunity to start turning this Titanic around, but it's unclear whether there will be the leadership to do so.
I want to hit the phone lines to see if folks have some questions. Person who called in with a blocked number, if you have a question for Dr. Perkinson, your line is open.
Hello?
Yes, you can be heard.
A blocked number and a blocked voice.
We can hear you.
Oh, you know what? I think that might have been me. I think I might have hit the button when I came in.
Oh, okay.
I was confused about being. I didn't know if I was supposed to hit that button or not.
Oh, okay. No problem. I did open a person's line up with a blocked number, though. A person different from Dr. Perkinson.
Oh, okay.
They might be just listening, which is okay. Last call. Yes, male voice that just spoke. Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, Dr. Perkinson and Gus.
Greetings.
Yeah, this was an excellent show. Dr. Perkinson, I was going to ask you about the rights of prisoners. What kind of rights do they have? Like once you get put in prison, does the Constitution protect your rights or no?
Excellent question. I mean, the Constitution itself doesn't say too much about that, except in the Bill of Rights it prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and there are protections that people should be convicted by due process. So it's really up to judges. It has been historically up to judges to decide what that means, what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, and what rights prisoners have. And and I'm glad you asked that question, because for most of American history, the judicial branch, with some exceptions, but for the most part, and there's a pretty solid set of precedents for this, up until the 1960s, judges said, you know what, people who are convicted of a felony are dead in the law. They have no more rights that we are due to respect than did a slave in the age of Dred Scott. And that was called the hands-off doctrine, because the idea was that the courts should not interfere with the criminal justice system, law enforcement, and especially prison administrators, and that was up to governors and legislators to supervise, not up to the courts. And for the most part, as I was saying earlier, the judicial branch in American history was set up by the framers of the Constitution to be the most conservative branch. It was set up to kind of check the populist impulses of the rabble by having lifetime appointments. And it behaved that way for most of American history, allowing corporations to gain greater and greater power, siding with corporations in almost all instances against unions, dismantling or thwarting many of Roosevelt's attempts to expand the New Deal. And there's one kind of chapter of exception in American history after the appointment of Earl Warren, when the Supreme Court, from this interval in the 50s up until the 80s, with the expiration of the Burger Court, when the courts regarded workers and women and immigrants and welfare recipients and the poor generally and subjugated people of color and prisoners as having rights that needed to be respected and sometimes required court order in order to be respected. And so there were a whole series of landmark cases protecting the rights of prisoners, starting with a famous case related to a Nation of Islam prisoner in Illinois in the 1960s. And finally, that led to the federal courts essentially taking over every prison system in the South and a good portion of the prison systems across the United States and subjecting them to kind of judicial consent decrees where they had to, have less crowding, they had to build new facilities, they had to offer programming, they had to discontinue physical punishment, they had to have due process for disciplinary hearings, they had to kind of rise to the level of kind of basic professionalism. They couldn't have convict guards anymore, and that happened in Texas in a kind of epic case called Ruiz versus Estelle. And the Texas prison system was quite fundamentally transformed, as were other southern prison systems. I mean, I contend in the book, if you kind of read the chapter about these civil rights cases, which I argue was really the kind of in a certain sense, it was a kind of final chapter of the civil rights movement and the prisoner rights revolution of the 1960s and 70s. I argue they weren't able to successfully dislodge Texas prisons from their slaving foundation, but they did make significant changes. But once the court, by the 1990s, with the ascendancy of the Rehnquist branch of the Supreme Court, and once a solid conservative majority was back in place, the Supreme Court and gradually the federal judiciary generally reverted to its standard and historic posture, which is, a bastion of protections for power rather than a final resort for those without power in American society. And when we're getting those kind of rulings now with the campaign finance, for instance, saying that corporations have all of the same rights of individuals, only they have billions of dollars at their disposal and hundreds of employees, and they can't be subjected to any kind of special government regulations. But we've also seen gradually, from 1996 forward, a shutdown of prisoner rights to the courts. And right now, there was a piece of legislation called the Prison Litigation Reform Act passed in 1996, signed by Bill Clinton, which essentially reasserted the hands-off doctrine and set barriers so high that very few prisoner complaints can be heard now by federal judges, and prison authorities are once again allowed to run prisons as they see fit. And as a result, we no longer really know much about what's going on in prisons, because in some ways the way that I had so many great stories, so many kind of compelling and sometimes harrowing stories for my book, is that all of the ways that the system was really working all came out in these federal court cases. And now that those are shut down, we really only have the word of the authorities. So we don't even know we know less about what's going on in our gigantic prison complex in the United States, 2.4 million people held behind bars on any given day, than we did 10 or 20 years ago.
Wow. Excellent question, 909. Excellent question. Person who called in, last four digits, 5128. 5128. Your line is open if you have a question for Dr. Perkinson.
Yes, hi, Dr. Perkinson.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you? Thank you for coming on the show. Just a really quick question. As you've done the research, and I respect your opinion, as a black male living in America, in your opinion, just given all that you know about the history of this system, I guess I'm seeking advice. What would you offer as the appropriate posture I should be in, given what you know? I mean, it sounds almost as if I'm not really safe leaving my house.
That's a great question, and I don't really know the answer to it. I know when I was living I went to grad school at Yale, and I was working with some New Haven community people on precisely this question after a local activist, her son was shot and killed by the police in a kind of standard traffic pull-off and pullover. And there's a lot of, you're right that there are a lot of organizations that are going around and saying, hey, you know what, we really need to make sure that our sons are not getting shot or arrested by the police, we have to have kind of training programs for young people to make sure that they don't, to give them very clear instructions on how they need to behave in the presence of law enforcement, keeping their hands, visible at all times. There was a kid shot for grabbing a Three Musketeers bar that has the shiny wrapper in New York City several years ago because it had a flash that looked like metal. So we did some of those trainings in New Haven, that kind of watching yourself when you go out your front door to try to keep yourself safe. My hope is that this system of this massive, colossal and incredibly wasteful system of imprisonment in the United States is not going to last forever. I think if you went back and the way I kind of console myself is if I imagine if you went back in 1850 and got together a bunch of abolitionists and asked them, how long do you think slavery will really last? And if they really were honest with themselves and looked at the huge numbers of profits that were involved in slavery, the companies, the politicians that were entwined with slavery, all of the white people who were the only ones who had the right to vote who were implicated in slavery either as owners or drivers or slave patrollers, you would think, wow, it might last another 100 years before we're finally able to overturn this incredibly profitable system. And yet, 15 years later, slavery was dead. Likewise, if you gather together a bunch of people in, integrationists and civil rights activists in 1940 and asked, how long will segregation rule in the South? George Wallace and others were saying it would last forever. They might have thought it would last 30 or 40 more years. And within 15 years, legal segregation was dead in America. So I have some hopes that this massive racially discriminatory imprisonment complex that we have built in the United States over the past 40 years can be dismantled or can be made to resemble a system more like the prison systems that exist in other countries that are genuinely designed to kind of protect the public and to rehabilitate people who get in trouble rather than to warehouse a whole generation of young people. But that's going to take, it was a system that was built by politics, and it's going to take politics to dismantle that. I think it will, it took a civil war to dismantle slavery, it took a freedom movement to dismantle Jim Crow segregation, and I think it will take another freedom movement to dismantle mass imprisonment.
Excellent question. Person who called in last four digits 0300, 0300. Your line is open.
Thank you, Gus. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Quite interesting show. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to
we can hear you.
After I ask my question or after I make my comment. It appears as though the system never ended in terms of when you look at the 13th Amendment. Did say that slavery was legal. We acquitted. Duly. And
You're breaking up a little bit there.
You hear me? Can you hear me better?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm outside, so I'll make my question brief or my comment brief.
No, it's okay.
With the 13th Amendment stating that slavery it was really never ended. It basically was transferred into the prison system, saying that a person who is duly convicted, can be subjected to involuntary servitude. Do you not see that we are headed in that direction in terms where those rights are going to be further removed from those that are convicted for crime? And what type of freedom movement would it take what has taken place in the past in terms of physical confrontation to end such a system? I just wanted to get your thoughts and comments, and thank you for your time.
That's a good question, and to address the first part of it, I think you're right that we have, and that's kind of the point of the book I wrote, Texas Tough, is to argue that, we tend to think of, most people anyway, I think the African American community is smarter about this because they're the community that's being primarily targeted, and have been primarily harmed by the rise of imprisonment, but most people tend to think, if you ask them about prisons, that they are created in order to respond to crime, and that the research fields and the politics of crime and punishment are quite different from the politics of civil rights. And my contention is that they really are entwined inextricably, and that we have indeed, with the creation of such severe statutes, and especially the drug war, that we've locked up so many people that we have undone some of the central victories of the civil rights movement. And in fact, if you look at all of the ways that a felon is treated unequally under the law, they are barred from voting in many instances. They're often banished for life from public housing. They're denied, for certain drug crimes, federal financial aid. They're barred from certain occupations, required to register themselves with authorities for sometimes sex crimes, but all sorts of other crimes oftentimes as well. They resemble all of these this apparatus of legal control are the same sorts of legal structures that were imposed on all African Americans during segregation. And they've been, all of this kind of machinery has been dusted off and is now used to control felons who are disproportionately African Americans. So the children of segregation, if they're convicted of a felony, as huge numbers, especially of young African Americans are subjected to the same sorts of control that their grandparents were under segregation, and that their grandparents under segregation were subjected to some of the controls, not as severe ones, but some of the controls that their great-grandparents were under slavery. So there is this way that history lives in the present, and that the way I think of it sometimes is that the ghosts of slavery are still with us, and they are still animating. They're still animate in the present, and in some ways, Jim Crow has been chased from the free world but has moved behind bars. In terms of how to move away from this, I was on a panel recently in New York, and we talked about this, and it's a really tough question, because a lot of the activists on the ground find that if they go into a legislature and start talking about, hey, we need to alleviate this statute or change this law because it's having such a racially discriminatory impact, in some ways they get less hearing, they get less traction with many legislators than if they just go in and start talking about cost and efficiency and public safety. So a lot of the organizations have kind of shied away from thinking of criminal justice as a civil rights arena. And that might make sense in the short term, but I think it's one of the reasons I wrote this book, Texas Tough, was to try and show people that, look, you're not going to be able to do that forever, that really the criminal justice system can't be separated from the history of racial subjugation and civil rights in America. And we really have to think of this as the next challenge of civil rights. And, in some ways American history is both a story of subjugation and inequality, and it's also a story of expanding freedoms, with the American Revolution, and then the extension of the franchise to all whites, not just because they own property during the Jacksonian period, then the abolition of slavery, the extension of the franchise to women, then to young people, and we really need to think now about kind of taking the next step toward freedom by dismantling this incredibly expensive and wasteful and socially corrosive prison structure that we have now that devours $70 billion a year and really, frankly, according to the best criminological research, does very little to protect the public.
Let's see. Someone called in with a blocked number. A person who called in with a blocked number, and you have a hand up. Your line is open.
Can I be heard?
I can hear, yeah.
All right, thanks for taking my call, Gus. My question is for your guest that he stated he went to Yale, and I was wondering George Bush and John Kerry went to Yale, and was there a secret society that was linked to white supremacy? The school of Yale?
Well, they do have these secret societies. They're just for undergraduates, and I went to graduate school there, and they are very strange-looking buildings with no windows, and they're kind of creepy, and we always kind of joked about them. I don't think they are a kind of networking organization for very powerful people, just like Rotary clubs or elite country clubs. But my own sense is that they aren't really anymore, despite their kind of bizarre secrecy and arcane rights, that they don't really have any more power in American society than any of these kind of elite country clubs or business organizations or the business roundtable. I think in some ways we can get distracted by paying attention to little secret organizations, and sometimes it can divert our attention to what's going on right before our eyes. The Business Roundtable is really, or the Chamber of Commerce, or the National Rifle Association, or the Tea Party movement, all of these organizations that are not secret, that are pursuing policies that exacerbate inequality in America, and they do it right before our eyes. I think these are organizations that are worth holding accountable and subjecting to scrutiny probably more than these secret societies, which I think are mostly kind of silly. But I never got invited inside, so who knows? Maybe they butcher babies in there. I don't know, but I don't think so.
We had another person who called with a question. I have two final ones I want to get in, then I have one more caller. This was a very interesting trend. Not everything is talked about. There are a lot of aspects of history that get buried and just become taboo subjects. This is from page 129 in Texas Tough. For some bosses, lashing flesh took on a twisted, even sadistic, homoerotic quality. When officers wanted to convey special dissatisfaction, they stripped off a convict's clothes and let loose on the naked hide, quote unquote. Other prisoners were made to watch or help pin the naked victim to the ground. After one particularly bloody episode, a manager had other convicts parade before him to, quote unquote, smell the bat. That's page 129. And then I'm moving forward. This is on page 352. One former detainee, this is talking about the immigration detention facilities. One former detainee who later pled guilty to nothing more than credit card fraud testified in federal court that he was repeatedly punched and kicked, paraded naked in front of female guards, cursed as a Muslim bastard, and anally violated with a flashlight. There seems to be a consistent trend of this sodomy and homoerotic abuse. Abner Louima, a lot of the pictures from Abu Ghraib. Can you kind of talk about this trend, and if you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, because the part of the stereotype, the kind of post-slavery stereotype that fueled lynching, had to do with this kind of like super potency or this hyper-sexualized masculinity myth of black men, that therefore when people wanted to subject black men to kind of special degradation, they tended to reach for kind of sexual tools, and that's why, you know, so many pageant-like lynchings in the 1890s involved castration in ways that, you know, extrajudicial killings of whites typically did not, and why you do get some of these spectacles of sexual degradation that took place in the prison system when guards were, you know, they usually didn't have to resort to this kind of sadism. One, because that sort of stuff, they might get in trouble with their superiors if it was too outlandish. And one, they had so many tools of degradation at their disposal and so much power that most people never challenged them. But periodically, when they really got going, or in isolated units, you do get these kind of spectacles of degradation that went on. And of course, we saw this again after 9/11, when the stereotype of Muslim men as being, having incredibly conservative notions of male masculinity and being repressed sexually and so on, that a lot of the interrogation tactics involved sexual humiliation that they thought would be especially trying for Muslim men, and therefore would kind of break their spirits faster and lead them to confess, even though we now know that most of the people subjected to this sort of humiliation didn't have anything to confess. And so you got, at Guantanamo, for instance, female interrogators smearing substance that looked like blood onto the face or hands of a detainee, telling them it was menstrual blood, flirting with them, as well as stripping them naked and subjecting them to, forcing them to engage in kind of homoerotic looking circus-like conduct. So there is that. I think there is that strain of sexualized racial debasement that runs from the late 19th century up through the present. Another strain is the victimization of black women for the kind of base pleasure of more powerful white men. And of course that was a central component of slavery. But if you look through the archives of black women imprisonment, and still there remains a very strong current of sexual victimization by guards, which has, improved somewhat in recent years, partially because DNA evidence has allowed some women to be able to prove it. If they can save a little bit of sperm from their victimizer, they can, whereas no one would believe them before, or no one would care. If they're able to get that mailed off to an attorney, they can often get a conviction in a way that they wouldn't have been able to in earlier eras. So, and that's certainly a strain. If you look all through the history of the women's incarceration in Texas, sexual liaisons between white male guards and female prisoners is a pretty important theme.
Texas Tough has information on that. It's only so much time. I have one more question, and then I'm going to get last caller. This is not in the book, but it's relative. Dr. Perkinson, he has a website devoted to this book, texastough.com. It's linked in the description for this program. If you click his name, it'll take you to the site. He has recent different articles and other interviews that he's done about this book. In one of your more recent articles, April 10th, 2010, you talk about the Texas Board of Education. They recently voted to eliminate a term from the list of words that school children have to master. Can you tell them what word they eliminated and why that's relevant to this discussion?
It's astonishingly, they eliminated the word justice from a list of citizenship virtues that kindergartners are supposed to kind of understand. And they also eliminated the term, I think, sharing with others, that they regarded as a kind of liberal educators spreading socialist ideas among the youth. There's this group of far right-wing Tea Party type kind of Christian jihadists who have taken over the Texas Board of Education and in some other southern and near southern jurisdictions, and are kind of really kind of pursuing this kind of Taliban-style theocratic education, but Christian instead of Muslim inside the United States. And in Texas, it's such a big state and has such influence with textbooks nationwide that it could have a significant impact on what everyone is learning. It's anti-scientific in that it's attacking the cornerstone of basic. It tries to prohibit teachers from sharing the facts of basic biology because evolution is so fundamental to the ways we teach biology and DNA and everything else that they can't really be separated. So it's trying to shut down the teaching of evolution. They're trying to rewrite American history such that slavery is taught as is really being the old states' rights canard of slavery rather than the Civil War being about the Civil War rather than the Civil War being about what it really was about, slavery, that everyone knew at the time and all legitimate historians have always known. They're trying to kind of fictionalize the kind of theocratic orientation of the founders, and on and on and on. There's this real effort to rewrite American history to be the sort of history that people were taught in the 1920s at the height of segregation, when American history is a simple story of white freedom-loving pioneers heroically working their way across the continent and leading the world toward progress and betterment, and conquest and genocide are little discussed, or just kind of subchapters, and slavery is a little exception. No reputable historians support this kind of point of view, and the academic establishment and the educator establishment is quite aghast. But it's symptomatic of how much confidence the far right has in America, and it's a peculiar artifact of current American politics that the far right has so much confidence. We've got people like Glenn Beck and other real extremists spouting their views with very little connection to the facts on major television networks, and there's really no equivalent on the left. Those with far left-wing views that might at all be considered equivalent to Glenn Beck are relegated to little internet radio stations and small online publications and little clubs. There's no Noam Chomsky or Louis Farrakhan having 30 million listeners on a radio or a television program in the United States. And I think that the fact that we have allowed, or that we have a system in place that allows these far-right views to gain legitimacy and only kind of moderate centrist left views has really kind of distorted the ways that our political debates are unfolding with so little basis in the facts. And we see that distorting the way we're dealing with global warming and the way we're dealing with education and all sorts of other, and healthcare and all sorts of other issues.
Sonny, if you have a question for Dr. Perkinson, your line should be open.
Yes. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Perkinson, I have been a victim of the homoerotic abuse from the suspects of racism, white supremacy, and the uniform of police officers. And I've been listening to what you've been saying about the facts, most specifically and importantly, the facts about what white people have done to black people over the centuries, and no doubt will continue to do to them. I want to know, based on the evidence, that if white people were to face a death sentence for committing these crimes against black people, should that be a possible avenue to pursue? I want to know if this would be yes or no, and why not. or why should it be?
Well, I mean, if we're going to have the death penalty, then certainly subjecting, law enforcement and military people and others who, in their official capacities, carry out far greater injustices than against greater numbers of people than the worst kind of low-level street criminal is something that ought to be considered. I mean, I've joked sometimes that if we had capital punishment for the derivatives traders who brought down the whole world with the banking crisis, or for the executives of Enron, maybe in that case the death penalty really would work as a deterrent against those sorts of people. Sadly, in reality, I mean, it's a good kind of rhetorical position to have, but sadly the death penalty is just so kind of broken in the way that it actually functions that I don't know if it would really help things out that much. Although maybe it would help by sending more white-collar criminals or official criminals to death row. Maybe we would start to get better conditions and better defense attorneys for those who are on there for other crimes. So yeah, it's not necessarily a bad idea.
So you're saying that it should be implemented into the law?
Well, I think we'd be better off getting rid of I think we would be better off as a society getting rid of the death penalty generally. But if we are going to have the death penalty, then it ought to be applied fairly. And that means, on the one hand, most obviously, everybody who is accused of a capital crime, or any crime for that matter, should have a really strong, robust defense so that we have a really adversarial criminal justice system. That would lead to many fewer people being on death row and make it much less likely that innocent people would be executed. On the other hand, it ought to be fair in that if we're going to execute somebody for killing one person in a botched armed robbery of a convenience store, then why shouldn't we be able to execute the chief executive of the Merck Corporation who intentionally hid the effects of Vioxx that led possibly to, thousands and thousands of deaths, and continued selling that and promoting that product and minimizing its risks even when its association with premature deaths became widely known. So yeah, I think if we're going to have the death penalty, it should be applied fairly, and that means applied fairly to poor defendants. They should have more protection, and we ought to go against the people like the executives of British Petroleum who have created this cataclysm in the Gulf.
Right. The white people who are in charge of the rape and murder, the premeditated rape and murder of black people, based on the persons who are giving and sentencing people to death penalties, like white people who do that to black people, and black people who are sentenced based on crimes committed, like stealing candy bars or maybe even robbing a bank. Who is more premeditatively responsible and who is not?
Yeah, and I agree with you. There should be harsher penalties for people who carry out egregious misconduct in their official duties, people who are supposed to be trained, than against kind of low-level street criminals. So, yeah, I agree. Soldiers who are involved in horrible human rights abuses, gang rape and homicides and torturing to death of prisoners, as has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, they and their commanders ought to be held to a higher standard and ought to be punished just as severely as someone who gets caught and convicted of a sex crime as a civilian. And likewise, police who engage in kind of torture, sexual torture, or sodomy, or homicide of an inmate, they ought to be punished to the full extent of the law, every bit as much, if not more, than the kind of pedestrian people who are generally punished for those crimes. Of course, as your caller knows, that's not typically the case. Instead, those people tend to get lighter punishments. They get reprimanded. They get fired. They might spend a little bit of time in jail. including, and oftentimes they don't get punished at all. It's very rare that prosecutors, for instance, even if they send someone to prison and ruin their entire lives, they might send an innocent person to prison for 40 years because they suppressed exculpatory evidence. Very rare that that prosecutor faces any kind of professional, much less criminal sanction, and that's wrong.
Right, so I guess the bottom line would be, are white people really going to police other white people and to stop practicing racism, white supremacy against black people? How do white people police white people?
Well, by having a more democratic, genuinely democratic society, so that the people who are holding the levers of power are not just white people, so that it's not white people policing white people, but it's society and a genuinely democratic government policing all people, would be a good way to start. Now, actually, this ties into a kind of current of thought that I think is worth remarking upon as we kind of close this up, and it's something I started to think of as I was writing this book, Texas Tough. And I talk a little bit more about this in the book, but there is this strain of thinking, and it dates all the, if you go back and look at black newspapers in the 20s, and it certainly was a strain of feminist thought in the 70s, that the way to achieve justice is to call for greater punishments of a certain type that for crimes that cause harm in our community. And so if you go back and look in the 1920s, all sorts of black newspapers are saying, we want more police and we want criminal prosecution against the whites who are causing depredations in our communities. And women mobilized in the 1970s to have greater punishment for domestic violence and for rape. So there has been a kind of civil rights strategy of calling for more punishments for those who kind of commit those sorts of crimes. And I think that it makes sense in a certain sense, but it can also be dangerous. I think what we really need to be searching for is a society that's not more punitive, even if it's more justly punitive, but a society that's less punitive, a society that tries to prevent crime and protect the public, not by locking more and more people up, but by providing more and more opportunity, not by kind of expressing our anger, but by kind of expressing our compassion. And I would much rather us have a society in which, more people had job and educational opportunities, and many fewer people of all hues, especially people of color, but also whites, were going to prison. I think there's too many people in prison now of all types. So I'm sometimes I worry about human rights organizations that call for greater punishment. Sometimes that's required. Obviously, when people are committing crimes with total impunity, then the strong fist of the law needs to be applied. But there are consequences sometimes to all of the domestic violence legislation that requires mandatory arrest and so on. In certain cases, that's prevented and helped women gain traction and prevented violence. In other cases, it's led to greater incarceration and longer rap sheets. And, women are sometimes subjected to those restrictions as well. Likewise, hate crime legislation, if people think that's only going to be used against whites committing hate crimes against blacks, they're probably mistaken, and it can also lead to greater penalties for anybody who gets in a fight and happens to say something that could be construed as racist, and that could mean it could be a person of color who says something that could be construed as racist against a white person too. So those sort of statutes, I think we should be skeptical of anything that calls for more punishment, and we should be looking to achieve justice to the extent that we can in other ways.
Groovy, I want to hop in. Thank everybody for sharing their time. Dr. Perkinson, thank you for sharing a bit of your Sunday afternoon. Very much appreciated the thoroughness of the book and your attention to detail. I took a lot of notes, and we'll be looking for other sources, some of the ones that you cited, to do some additional reading. We'll check the blog, TexasTough.com, and the book, Texas Tough, The Rise of America's Prison Empire, Dr. Robert Perkinson. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, sir. You too. Context of white supremacy, Gus T Renegade. Not sure. Folks felt the information was constructive, but I feel like I learned quite a bit reading the book, and hopefully he shared some of the information that I saw in the book that I read in the book. Hopefully people who listened in found it constructive. I do want to make sure I read that passage one more time just to make sure people didn't miss that. This is from page 129. When officers wanted to convey special dissatisfaction, they stripped off a convict's clothes and let loose on the naked hide. Other prisoners were made to watch or help pin the naked victim to the ground. After one particularly bloody episode, a manager had other convicts parade before him to, quote unquote, smell the bat. Page 129, footnoted, the whole nine, from Texas Tough. White people have incredible access to information. I do want to point out, I strongly suspect Dr. Perkinson. Can the folks that are on the line be quiet? I did open lines up so people can share their thoughts briefly, but there's a lot of background noise. Yeah, Dr. Perkinson, I do think he shared constructive information on the program. I also suspect that he practiced racism, white supremacy, and I especially wanted to make sure I did not forget when he gave the line about white people, racist white supremacists, restructuring during the so-called, or after the so-called civil rights movement, so that if any black person was going to move in next to them, they would have to be like the Cosbys. I don't even think that's accurate, because white people who practice racism, white supremacy, mistreat non-white people. It doesn't matter if you are, quote unquote, like the Cosbys. In fact, you can go watch Angel Heart with Lisa Bonet, and that might give you a good indication of how white people feel about the Cosbys. Angel Heart, Lisa Bonet, it came out when the Cosby Show was, the greatest television show in the history of the universe. Angel Heart, Lisa Bonet, 1987. And you can see how white people feel about the Cosbys. I was reminded of Dr. Welsing's lectures, because she frequently reminds folks that Bill Cosby's son executed. Some rumors that he was going to meet a white person, a little murky, but that could be a cowbell ring on top of that. And I believe even Bill Cosby has public examples where it looks like he was mistreated because he was not white. So I did want to point that example out. But I do think he had some constructive information, perhaps. I also wanted to share, loyal listener, that'll be my legacy from the C.O.W.S, Gus T Renegade. He encouraged other non-white people to reference themselves as misanthropes. Non-white victim, she was saying, commenting on how much time and energy non-white people invest in birthday parties for their children. And I don't know, under the system of white supremacy where non-white people are being locked up and sodomized on a regular basis, maybe we could invest our time and energy in something a little more constructive other than, massive outings to Chuck E. Cheese or wherever else we're going to celebrate. But I did think that was a great point. I wouldn't have thought of that because I don't have offspring. Yeah, I got to read that again. And the last thing I wanted to say before bringing folks on, make sure I promote everybody's upcoming broadcasts. Cree 7, support her blog first and foremost, cree7.wordpress.com. Again, cree7.wordpress.com. She has a show coming up on June 13th. June 13th, she will have Dr. William Darity. He'll be making his second appearance on her program. That's next Sunday. I can give you the time in one moment when my screen moves over. In the meantime, between time, remember that Sunday, June 13th, Dr. William Darity, he'll be on Cree's program. Next week, tune in, should be constructive, counter-racist, evolving engineer. And also support Back to the Buses blog as well, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. The cows will be back on Wednesday. Persistence. This is someone I've been trying to track down for almost a year. Black male. He is the author of Pipe Dream Blues, and he is the author of Hitler's Black Victims. He wrote a review. When I was talking to him, I mentioned that Raphael Sheck was just on the program. He's like, oh, I wrote a review for that book. Should be very constructive. Clarence Lucene. Pipe Dream Blues is all, man. Pipe Dream Blues, excellent follow-up to this program, because Pipe Dream Blues is all about how the war on drugs has been racism, white supremacy to the core. He even talks about how the kits and tools that they use to administer drug tests, even those are skewed to produce racist results, so that if you are a black person, you will be more likely to test positive when taking these tests. His book, Pipe Dream Blues, even addresses that. So that's this Wednesday. I can give you the time on that, I believe. Yes, that should be this Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 11 a.m. Pacific. Clarence Lucene will probably split the program to half on Pipe Dream Blues and the other half on Hitler's Black Victims. But that should be constructive. Okie doke. Everybody that called in, your line is open if you would like to share thoughts. We are definitely not hanging for the full extra hour, but, share whatever you'd like to say.
Hey, Gus, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Hey, Gus, it's funny you just mentioned that the upcoming author and his research into how the drug tests are even skewed racially, and it struck a note, because I failed a drug test some years back, and never exposed to drugs, never touched drugs, and to this day I was baffled at how I could have failed a drug test. And I just think that's just, I'll definitely be tuning in to that broadcast. But excellent show.
Thanks. Codified response. So what? Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. But yeah, Clarence Lucene's book, reading. When I first moved to the West Coast, I bumped into a black male, and he told me about this book, Pipe Dream Blues. He's like, you should read this book. It's great. And I was still very confused about white supremacy. But he said you'll probably have a tough time finding it, but it's excellent. And I went to a used bookstore in San Francisco. It's called Dog-Eared Books. If you're in Bay Area, Dog-Eared Books is an excellent bookstore. I walked in and browsed around, and they had it, bought it, and read it. I devoured it. It was I remember the line that stuck with me. He talks in the early part of the book that if you are a white high school dropout, you are more likely to get a job than a black college graduate. And I remember reading that line, and I just remember it was like a brick hit me in the face when I read that line. But yeah, Clarence Lucene, Pipe Dream Blues. I would highly encourage folks, read that book if you can find it.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought it was real interesting when you had your guest on, that he spoke about many ways and gave facts about how racism is practiced against black people in many creative ways. But he himself and other officials who are white people do not come up with creative ways to police the white people who do these things to black people. They are intelligent, smart people, and they have intricate detail on the smallest moon crater that orbits Saturn, and they know how to get there, and they know how to make the technology in order to make sure that the traveling navigation is safe for a return and photographs to be taken of those pictures of those moon craters, which means that they have an abundant ability to think creatively and stop this problem. And it is just obvious. It is totally obvious that they have no intention on stopping. They have a lot of intention on talking, but they don't want to help us. Unfortunately, I'm coming to this bottom line amongst all of them. What are your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree more.
So I think like the most interesting thing on that note is just to reveal, based on just talking to them, is just reveal that they just don't want to do it. And the talking, I guess, develops into the wording that will come out of their mouth that would say, oh, well, yeah, you're right, sir. We don't have any intention of stopping. I think that would be very beneficial for black people to hear, because we believe in words and we believe in the dialogue of what can happen for us, what they'll do for us. And it makes us feel good, but when that's all is said and done, we're crying all over again because they haven't stopped. And that conversation took place 10 years ago. And here we go with the same problem all over again. In fact, it's worse because we're sleeping with them and we're talking with them, and they're doing this to, us and our cousins in Texas, Florida, Atlanta, and whatnot. And we just get to hear about the stories, and we have no proof of any solutions. Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Oh, just making sure, Gus. Yeah, this show was excellent, man. I like books like this. Just breaking down the information and this book gets my juices flowing. Hey, you spent some time in Hawaii, haven't you?
Yes, sir. Don't buy this book. Let me make sure I get that out. Don't buy these books. If a white person wrote it, don't buy. The upcoming show, you can buy Pipe Dream Blues, Hitler's Black Victims. Don't buy this one, though. Go to the library. Go to the library. Go to the library. Yes, I've been to Hawaii.
Yeah. While he was talking, man, I spent some time out there, too, a couple of years on Oahu. Yeah, man, I had to kind of, vision myself there, man, with some of the stuff he was saying, just to calm down. But I was just like, man, some of the facts he was bringing out, what he said it's worse than the Jim Crow era. He said during the Jim Crow era, we was getting in prison 4 times the rate of whites. He said, and now we getting in prison 7 times the rate of whites. So, I know people be asking if they think if things getting better. That's the facts right there.
Yeah, a lot of information. Yep. That's why I talk to white people. I mean, they are very informed. I agree with Sonny. I do not believe white people have any intention of discontinuing the system of white supremacy, none whatsoever. And in fact, I agree with Michael Bradley. That's what I think about when I look at the so-called oil spill. When Michael Bradley was on the program and said that white people would blow the planet up before they discontinue the practice of white supremacy. So, but I do talk to white people because they are very informed, and my hope is that non-white people who are a little more confused, when they hear a white person breaking off information like that, that will challenge their conditioning and perhaps clue them in as to what's happening on the planet, hopefully. Don't know if that happens or not.
Right. And in my mind, I'm thinking, what should be done about a people who, for eternity, will never stop mistreating black people on the basis of color and will never get rid of the system of white supremacy? What should we do then?
That's why this book is so important. I mean, you read this book, and you get if this book is in your memory bank, and you're faced with somebody that, you know, could have done this, you know, could be, you know, benefited from this type of behavior. I mean, that's what this information is for. So you won't be talking like, you know, we all human and this and that. You know, you got the facts. It's showing you right here what goes down, and they unrepentant. They don't care. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, if you warrior class, you shouldn't care when it's time for their justice. That's what I think. That's why I like this kind of material, because it puts you in the right state of mind to do what you have to do when it's that time. That's what I think. I mean, he's kicking in Hawaii. I like I said, I used to live out there. I mean, he's doing his research. He's in Hawaii. He's at it's a beautiful, beautiful campus, man. You feel what I mean? You know, he's putting the information out there. Gus is bringing it to us, and I just hope people read this kind of material and get some understanding, because, like you said, they're not stopping. They have a plan. What Nellie Fuller said, tailoring,
population tailoring.
Yes, exactly. That's what's happening. That's why they don't. They know how to do. They know the things that they know more than us. They know how to clean up spills and stuff like that. They know how to have better technology and better energy. They're not doing it because they don't want to do it. They want to get rid of us first, and then they want to, you know, come with all the clean this and that. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. So I just hope people read this.
Yeah, white people are extremely extreme. They are extreme in their nature, because they live in an extreme contrast from their body to the solar system. First, their bodies are in extreme pain, so they have to compensate from that because they don't have melanin. And if you don't have melanin in the brain, then you're imbalanced. And in order for you to create balance, you have to change your environment to suit you. So they have changed and created an artificial system to compensate for their imbalance. But so, you know, based on my studies and what I observe, and by their behavior, that is what they do, they constantly think of ways to refine the words and deeds to just simply compensate for that lack of sexual potency, that lack of that oomph that they don't have, that the thing that they desire the most that they can't have the way that we have it. So they mistreat, and they will keep on mistreating until they get it. And if they get it, I doubt that they'll get it through the technology, because nobody has ever pinpointed what melanin really is, the melanin aura that they don't have. But yeah, they're deathly afraid of the sexuality of black males. That is the most conscious thing that motivates them. Jealousy is a strong emotion, in my opinion. And many things have been done based off of that motivation. That emotion makes your brain hypersensitive to the people in your environment that you're afraid of. And based off of that drive alone, that will create a hypersensitive towards doing the very things that will cause these people to be totally mixed up and disrupted and confused, so that you can keep that focus off of themselves.
Yeah, Gus kept ringing the cowbell when he was saying integration, because that's what it boils down to, man. That's when they created all of these laws, you know, integration, cowbell, and that's when all these laws, you know, get on the books, and so, you know, crack cocaine and the profiling and the whatnot. So they definitely have some type of. I mean, we can see that the miscegenation / integration. That's when a lot of these laws come about. And so, like when he was saying, yeah, I don't think white people sat down in a room and planned this stuff out. I wanted to say, yeah, buddy, keep your opinions to yourself. You know, to keep your opinion, you know. But it was cool though. But at the same time, I'm thinking in the back of my head, like, yeah, but Gus proved it though already. You know, with his own material. Yeah, they got to figure it out. You know, the result is the same. So, you know, the same result. So, you know, yeah, come on now. But yeah, I find white people always they always say that for some reason. I guess that's one of that's something that they have to say, is that, yeah, I don't think there was no grand and great conspiracy. You know, it just happened this way. Yeah, come on, man. It's a plan. But yeah, Gus proved it in his with his own work. So yeah, that was good.
I got to play devil's advocate here. Maybe there truly isn't a conspiracy. I mean, if it's just part of their nature, no conspiracy needed. Just going about doing their day-to-day thing. And while it appears to us to be a conspiracy, it's just a fact of life for them.
Well, he said nobody sat down and planned that we're gonna, you know, plant these things out. And Gus proved that, yeah, they do. I don't know about the word conspiracy, but yeah, they plant the result that they wanted to see. Yeah, they planned it. They sat down, mapped it out, and carried it out.
You know, it is funny though how he kind of downplayed the events that take place on Yale's campus. I mean, even though some have dismissed it as just conspiracy theory, it cannot be argued that some world leaders, in this case, I guess in this part of the world, are definitely members of those societies that come from Yale's campus. And I just thought it was pretty interesting how it was kind of downplayed. So yeah, you're right. There's definitely a conspiracy. There's some that may not be completely clued in on the conspiracy, but they all participate nonetheless for the same ends.
Gus, he really this show when I was listening to it, I was thinking that Gus really, I don't know, I mean, I don't know, the way how calm he was and how the interview came about, it just, I was thinking like, damn, this is hard work right here. Gus is like, it didn't seem like it just sounded like a conversation, but I was just thinking that was pretty hard work, getting this information out, and I don't know. That's just a thought that I had. This was some real work that was being done. I mean,
the way I look at it.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, talking to a white man that lives in Hawaii and teaches out there, and him saying these things about what goes on in the prison system and him knowing about these things, I mean, it's just like, damn, how do you feel about your people? You know, it's like, you know, what, like kind of the one last caller asked, he kind of was like, dang, you know, like, what's up, man? How do you feel about, what, you know, how, if you were the judge of your people, I mean, how would you judge them after doing all of this research? This is, I don't know, it's good stuff.
Just looking from my observations and, you know, just paying attention, it appears that white people dominate non-white people. And everything, and I mean, so that means everything they say and do is for the purpose of, I can't say everything, but everything, their main purpose of saying anything and doing anything is for the purpose of dominating non-white people. Everything else they do is just extracurricular.
Absolutely, I definitely agree with that right there. Every word spoken while they're speaking to us is definitely for the sole purpose of maintaining and refining the system of white supremacy. They always know what the bottom line is, and they are always extreme in doing that. Even a subtle conversation means that they are extreme, because if they're always focused on racism, white supremacy, then they have to be extreme. And the evidence of that is based on the fact that it has been existing for quite some time and still exists today. And if they're going to maintain it and keep it in existence, then they never keep their eyes off the ball. And for a person to do that, that means that they definitely have to be extreme, because you got to consider all the factors. You may think, while they're practicing racism, white supremacy, that they're not having fun. They're extreme. They are having fun. The sole mindset behind all things said and done and all things learned from and by white people doing what they do, you have to have a different type of brain in order to make practicing racism, white supremacy fun. That's why we have to have a different kind of evolved brain to practice counter-racism at all times, and that's fun. You see, I didn't think that would actually be fun until I started to do it more frequently. And the more frequently I did it, the more clearer I was able to see the tightness of the relationship between black people and white people around me constantly. Every time I have an encounter with a white person, I always know, based on what they're telling me, that they know that they're talking to a black person. You see what I'm saying? So the information that I get from them, based on what they decide to tell me, is marginalized by who they're talking to constantly. So I just ask them questions.
I would just add to that not just when a white person is talking to a non-white person, but when the white person is talking to another white person too, it's for that same purpose, at least primarily maintaining white supremacy.
Oh, absolutely. You know, that's how they sharpen and refine ways of deceit, long usage of words and explanations to talk around something that can be said so simply to a black person. They're always learning from each other. They're watching each other while they talk to each other. I'll go and talk. Well, I won't initiate a conversation with a white person. I'll probably be purchasing something, and they'll be behind the cash register. And while I'm talking to them, I know I can, based on what I've experienced in the past, they listen. They're always listening. And they're always listening to other white people talk to black people. And that's for the sole purpose of refining deceit.
Well, he said a third of black men will spend time in prison at these days. So I think you got to keep that in mind when you want to go to the club and hang out with non-white people, black people in particular, and a third of black males will spend time in prison. A third.
And I guess that will be worldwide too, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I got to throw this in there. Dr. Baruti, I purchased his series entitled Menticize. I highly recommend it. But there's a particular portion of that series where he discusses the imprisonment rate in other parts of the world, and he discusses probabilities, and I mean, he's a sociologist, so he gets into all of the percentages. But in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, it's actually worse. So you take a place like Australia, where I think the non-black population is 3% of the country, or of the continent, but 83% of the prison population are people of color. The UK, England, no better. I mean, it's global.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Dr. Baruti's work, highly recommended. I mean, the work, the DVDs, quality work. I mean, perfect. I'm buying it for gifts for people. It will be their birthday presents, their Christmas presents, even though I don't celebrate that stuff. But I believe this is information that definitely has to be widely disseminated. We really have no idea of what type of war we truly are in. I mean, we talk about it. We're more informed than a lot of others. I thought I was informed, but after sitting and listening to Dr. Baruti teach and really break down the numbers, as non-whites, we shouldn't have our kids in their schools. We shouldn't have our kids watching their television. I mean, our sole focus, if we are concerned and care about the future of our people as a race of people, or as just people, period, that should be our complete focus. I mean, we literally, as the caller said, when we go out to the club, if you're going to the club, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if we're not even asking for what these people have in store for us. We got to realign our priorities.
We've been well trained. I just wanted to throw in Dr. Baruti, Irritated Genie, and now Dr. Perkinson, a white person, have all commented on how white people have sodomized and or engaged in homosexual activity as a means of practicing racism, white supremacy. You can add an and or encouraged non-white people to participate in so-called homosexual activity, even with other non-white people, as a means of practicing racism, white supremacy. You now heard 3 people say that. So anybody who thought that was crazy, didn't make sense, you've now even heard a white person say it and provide evidence of that. So think about that.
Absolutely. I have no illusions that that type of mistreatment is definitely one of the main tactics that they like to enjoy doing to black males as a means of how they feel inside. They feel small inside. So sexually humiliating a black male is compensation for how small they feel inside and how they can't measure up. So they have to reduce the measure of how they look at a black male. It's like a poodle to a pit bull, or a poodle to a Great Dane. And As a matter of fact, my personal experience with that was from a police officer who's a white male, and he pulled me over. I wasn't in the car. I was walking on the street, and he stopped his car in front of me. He asked me to put my hands behind my back, and as soon as I asked him why, he pulled out mace and he maced me in my eyes. I went to my knees. He kneed me in the back, put his hands on me, cuffed me up, and on the way to the ride, when I got to the actual jail itself, without no question or anything else, several police officers jumped on me, stripped me down completely naked, and dragged me into a cell. So that was my encounter with the sexual tactic that they use.
But things are getting better, though, right? I mean, we're not getting whipped.
No, they're not. They're not getting better. Things are not getting better. Because that's just the tip of the iceberg right there.
I mean, but wait a minute, you're not getting whipped. You know, you're not getting whipped no more. I mean, this is not slavery days. I mean, isn't that an improvement?
When you compare pepper spray in your eyes for about 5 hours, and you think about when your mother told you to pull your pants down and whoop your bare butt, the pain that lasted from the whooping did not last as long as the mace directly to the eyeball. But whipping, if they were to whip, that would be an obvious, it would just be too obvious to people. But mace is not so obvious to people. You know, it's a refinement from the whipping. They have to refine their mistreatment. So they went from the whip to the mace. And they went from the mace to the paintball, to the hard little balls that they use when they shoot you. They went from that and they went to tasers. You see? So they refine their ways of hurting you physically. And one of the main ways that they hurt us physically is by the deprivation of depriving you of things. When you ask for things, when you go into a store, they'll direct you to what you ask for, but they don't give you what you need. You see? You always get something short of what is due to you, and that's hurting you. You know, and that's cruel. So they're very smart when it comes to cruelty. You see? And it's good to face the pain of talking about it, because by facing the pain and talking about it, we're able to deal with it physically and emotionally. Well, I'll tell you, for me personally, I mean, me talking about it was 100% better than me not talking about it, because if I didn't talk about it, maybe I would have taken that out on one of you. I would have taken that out on a black female, or I've probably taken that out on a kid, or myself, or a white, you know. So the thing is when I understand what's going on, when I talk about it, ask questions and get different types of information from people to piece together my limited knowledge of what's going on around me, the more that I learn, the different my conduct outside of my resting spot becomes. I do different things based on how I've been treated. And I try not to mistreat other people based on how I've been treated, especially black people.
Would you say it is difficult, though? Like, just dealing with the victimization that you get every day as a black male, that it is difficult sometimes to avoid, or it is difficult to be courteous with other black people, victims of white supremacy, to treat them correctly? That's tough sometimes?
I think it is tough if the person that you're dealing with has limited knowledge of what's going on, because they're going to be insensitive, short. They're going to say something crazy or stupid that doesn't have nothing to do with what's going on, or, you know, they're going to be insensitive and laugh. Now, based on those type of people, you know, I don't know what anyone else's experiences have been when they try to seek counsel from another brother. But, you know, looking at these people and being able to judge for myself who's who, you know, and reading people, being able to read people and know that they're not going to have the type of understanding that I'm going to need when I decide to tell my story. So I stay away from them, far away. And I seek counsel from those who I suspect will understand me more. And they have usually been older black males. I'm not saying that they were my friends at the time, but I took a risk, and I just decided to open up my mouth and just started to talk to them. And, you know, they turn around and say, I understand. And they had the same stories that I had. And I was able to really, you know, get open and get honest about what happened to me. And the funny thing about it, man, is that most of these people didn't come in the form of my family members. These are just people. This is just certain people out in the world, strangers. It's unfortunate, but you know what? I'll take it wherever I can get it, because I need it.
Would you say that being in that position of taking it from wherever you can get it, that as a black male, or really as a black person, period, that does leave you in a vulnerable position?
Absolutely. But I'm willing to be in a vulnerable position because I'm a risk taker. I'm willing to take that risk to learn something I've never learned before. Because I ain't learning nothing by doing the same thing I've always done. Because I'm going to get what I always got. So yeah, I remember one time I slept outside with a homeless dude who we hit it off, man. I was talking to him, he was talking to me, we were talking about life, and we were just getting open with our situations and whatnot. And you know what, I just kicked it with him all night. I understood where he was coming from, and understood where I was coming from. Next morning, gave him $1, I was on my way. And guess what? About a year later, I was stranded downtown. I didn't know how to get home. I lived miles away from home. And the same dude gave me money to get home. He was still homeless, and he gave me money to get home. He was a black male. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but I'm saying if I did not take that risk, how would I have ever known? You know, black males really want to help each other out, but we have no means to do so. But I suspect if we did, we would. And I believe we would because of what happened to me. We angry at each other when we walk up and down the streets because we don't really have much to give to each other. But if we try to follow the logic and find things to learn and try to just get as much as we can from any source that we seek, it's going to be good, it's going to be bad. But we will you just eat the meat and spit out the bones of what people tell you. And based on, you know, the little knowledge that you get, or learning how to do something constructive, you're able to help somebody else with what you've learned. You know, when I got locked up, I learned how to cut hair while I was up in jail. You know, I did it for 8 months, and when I got out, I'm over here cutting people's hair. You know, so, you know, people from the hood or whatever who didn't have enough money. So I meet them halfway, they meet me halfway. And I never got into any problems with none of them, because every time I came around them, I did something constructive for them, and they did something constructive with me. And I kept it moving, and they kept it moving. I never hung around nobody just to hang around nobody because I already knew. I've been knowing that that's going to cause problems. I've already known a few people that got shot up just because it was hanging out by cops and other black people. So that's a no-no.
Thank you for sharing, Sonny. I know as a black male, a lot of us, we've been severely abused by the system of white supremacy, and try as hard as we can to hold some shattered bit of pride and dignity together. I know it can be tough to, share how you have been abused and mistreated under this system of white supremacy. Thank you again for sharing. White people have allowed me another 5 minutes. If you all want to share anything, I do have the time for Cree's program now. It's 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Pacific, Sunday, June 13th. That'll be with William Darity Part 2 next Sunday, Counter-Racist Evolving Engineers. But we have 5 minutes.
Yeah, Sonny, I wanted to thank you too, man, because I'm somebody that's against therapy and things like that. But what I've noticed about just what you guys said is that I got a lot in common with with what you said. So I mean, maybe that's a good thing, because I heard a lot.
Yeah, it is a good thing.
Yeah, we got.
I mean, not what happened to you is a good thing, but it's a good thing that we talk about it, because black males ain't trying to tell each other their business like that, because we are still trying to put a big brick wall around our emotions. If you're strong enough to express your emotions, you're gonna grow, because we all got them, and our emotions are here to serve us, not the other way around. But go ahead, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I just think the commonality, that's I don't know. I feel something about the common story that you told, and I'm younger than you, but I've got the same kind of things that happen to me, especially like when you're talking about the homeless guy and stuff like that. Yeah, I've done that before, and I never talked to nobody about it, but it's pretty interesting. We have a lot in common. I think as black males, we probably don't really know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, let's say, for instance, you told me that story about you and the homeless dude, right? And versus talking about the same old things that we usually talk about when we together as boys. Now, they cool because we're interested in sports, we're interested in females and whatnot, but how often do you tell stories where you serve somebody and somebody served you? That's cool, because you will, once you start to talk about things you never spoke about before, then you learn more than you've ever learned before, because the person listening to you can think differently. You're giving them the benefit of thinking differently. And we've been taught and programmed to shut our minds off, shut our brain computers off, and not get honest with each other. And the more that we are honest with each other, you'll find your circle getting smaller and smaller and smaller, for the better, because the people who will stick around are the ones who are going to be most beneficial, because they'll be open to. Yeah, and that's pretty much what happened with me. I used to have a lot of so-called friends, tons. But they got smaller. Once we got older, they got smaller and smaller based on what people were doing. Those who stayed out of jail are the ones who didn't hang around black males. And, and it's logical because black males are people who are hunted. They hunt for us and they scream for us. Yeah. Black males in prison equals more black females to be taken by white males. They're black females. They are trying to keep us separated. And they're very successful at doing it because we haven't gotten it yet.
60 seconds. 60 seconds.
Excellent show. I just hope people will get the archives and just study, get their knowledge up. That's it. Replace white supremacy with justice.
Immediately. Thank you again for sharing, Sonny. Excellent example of countering racism and willing to share about how we've been abused, all of us. Thank you again for sharing, sir. We'll be back.
Absolutely.
We'll be back Wednesday. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Yeah, that'll help this time. Right on. Cal signing out. Thank you all.